You're listening to The Divide. My name is Ira Xu. It's been a year since I first began covering Hong Kong's media tycoon Jimmy Lai and the trial against him.
What I think people have to remember about Jimmy Lai is one thing. The guy basically stood up against his own self-interest in the short term, his personal self-interest. He lost his company. They've confiscated his bank accounts. But he did this for over 30 years because he believes in democracy and he believes in Hong Kong. And the other thing, too, that's so unique about him as a leader, it's really why it's hard to place him, is he wasn't looking for political power. He was just trying to protect Hong Kong. And I know that. That's what I'm saying.
More than a year since I started covering the story, Mr. Lai still remains in prison today, awaiting a verdict from 3 Beijing-appointed national security judges. At age 77, he could still face life imprisonment. Today I'm speaking with someone who knows Jimmy Lai and even published a book about the Apple Daily founder.
My name's Mark Clifford. I am the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation.
Mark is the author of the book, The Troublemaker: How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic.
And I lived in Hong Kong 28 years, and I love the place dearly.
We all know Jimmy Lai as a successful business owner that founded the pro-democracy media company Next Digital, which published the most popular Chinese language newspaper, the Apple Daily. But Mark's book, The Troublemaker, goes beyond the headlines and tells the extraordinary life story of Jimmy Lai that's unknown to many.
Jimmy has an incredible story. That's the story of one man and his journey from poverty, political persecution in China, to not just prosperity, but unimaginable wealth in Hong Kong. And then a journey on freedom that saw him first embrace the cause of democracy and political freedom in Hong Kong, and eventually saw him find freedom in God and his Catholic faith, and now sees him sitting in a maximum security prison in Hong Kong and on trial for his life, effectively, on national security law charges that could see this 77-year-old man put behind bars or remain behind bars in jail for the rest of his life. So it's a story of Jimmy, but it also parallels the story of Hong Kong, a place that was swollen, overwhelmed with refugees from Maoist China. At the time Jimmy arrived in 1960, 61, as a 12-year-old boy, with people sleeping in the streets, living in shanty towns and huts, disease, crime, all sorts of social problems rampant, no housing, of course. And Jimmy and millions of people like him worked hard, took advantage of the freedoms that the British colonial system offered, for all its imperfections. But compared to China, people like Jimmy didn't have to worry that the police were going to drag them away in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. They knew they could get a fair shot in the courts, and he prospered. He went from working in a factory to owning a factory, and just 15 years after he arrived, 5 years after he bought a bankrupt sweater factory, it was the biggest sweater maker in Asia, selling to us, well, in Hong Kong, probably in Asia, selling to some of the biggest companies in the world. Jimmy was rolling in unimaginable wealth and riches, but he's a kind of crazy, restless, serial entrepreneur of whom there were so many in Hong Kong, and who took advantage of the kind of fantastic ecosystem and climate that encouraged entrepreneurialism, encouraged the kind of hustle, get out and go, travel the world, sell your things. And he started a clothing chain. Became really the father of fast fashion. The head of Uniqlo, Tadashi Yanai, of course, runs the most successful retailer in the world today, came down to study from Jimmy and to learn from Jimmy. And Jimmy, unlike Yanai, was not an empire builder. He was always on to the next thing. And after the Tiananmen killings of 1989, he decided he'd go into media. He loves China, but he despises the Chinese Communist Party. And he thought by taking his business skills and going to media, he could bring accountability to the Chinese Communist Party and either reform it or see it go away and see more social and political reforms to accompany broad economic reforms as well.
And Mark started the book with Lai's childhood and family background, where he was living and grinding in poverty in the mainland.
Well, I think that to understand his background is you can't understand him without understanding where he came from. It's a remarkable story. As you say, if you made this up, it would sound like it was, yeah, some kind of fairy tale, some kind of fiction. But it was the story of so many people in China, unfortunately, the poverty and the political degradation and humiliation. He was born just a couple of years before Mao took power in 1949 and ushered in these 75 plus years of communist Chinese rule. Is an interesting family. His mother was the second wife who had married into a prosperous shipping family. The first wife was not well, and Jimmy's mother, who was always called Mother Number Two, was treated in a very humiliating fashion by the family, the first wife's family was a peasant woman, and she was expected to bear children and take care of the first wife's kids. But the whole family was splintered after the revolution. And the irony is his mother, this poor peasant woman who'd been dragooned into this family in some senses, was then regarded as a class enemy. And the husband went off to Hong Kong, leaving Jimmy's mom, his twin sister, and a sister who was a couple years older, to fend for themselves. But the mother was seen as I said, as it was caught up in these political struggles, was sent off to what Jimmy always calls labor camps, but it was a little more fluid than being sent out to the Laogai out in the West or something, because she was able to come home on weekends. But still, you think of this. Jimmy and his siblings are 4 years old, 6 years old. Their mom is away for most of the week. She's a cook there. She was a great cook. And she deliberately burn rice so she could bring home some of the burned rice for, to hope to feed the kids. Jimmy is out there hustling on the streets. He's finding half-smoked cigarettes and breaking them up, re-rolling the tobacco, selling them. He's stealing metal and selling that on the scrap metal on the black market. So I think it's important to understand that here's a guy who's a primary school dropout who succeeded beyond expectations. And so it gives him the kind of confidence that many entrepreneurs have, but I think few have in the sense that Jimmy does, the sense that you can knock me down, you can throw anything at me, and I will get up and I will come back stronger. And there, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, famously said, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Well, actually, in most cases, that isn't true. For 10,000 people, most of them just get killed. Or maybe it is true. Most of them don't make it. But Jimmy is one of these 1 in 10,000, I would say 1 in 1 billion people who came back with an unshakable belief in himself and also in the principles of freedom, and those things would guide him throughout his life.
Speaking of principles of freedom, how important or what was the impact of Apple Daily as a newspaper within Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Iris, because it's hard to convey how important it was. I mean, first of all, just visually, Jimmy came out of the fashion industry. He was, again, selling clothes that had to appeal to consumers. So he had a great sense for design, a great sense for color, and a great sense for as a retail marketer. Now, what does this have to do with a newspaper? Well, newspaper, you got to sell those things every day. You have to sell hundreds of thousands of days every day. And Hong Kong was an incredibly competitive retail market, newspaper market. And the first time I met him in 1993 was he was getting ready to launch Apple Daily, and he walked through as a businessman how he was going to break into this very very crowded media market. And point number one is he had what I guess in the retail buzzword you'd say unique selling point, his USP. He was going to promote democracy. And he went through newspaper by newspaper, all his competitors, how their owners were all pulling back because they were afraid of mainland China, which was going to take over in 1997. So Jimmy, it's actually almost a classic Warren Buffett investment strategy. Buffett always liked to invest in businesses that have moats around them. So you have a castle in the center and you have a big moat that nobody can cross. And in Jimmy's case, his castle, which he knew people would want to live in or buy the newspaper, was the democracy angle and his advocacy for democracy. And the moat was the fear that everyone else felt about the Chinese Communist Party. So in a very strange way, the Chinese Communist Party created Jimmy Lai's media empire. But I mentioned the visual part, and maybe that seems like, okay, what does selling shirts have to do with selling newspapers? Well, Jimmy's design eye is unbelievable. And he actually went on later to study with Wallace Ting, the renowned Chinese-American painter, became very good friends with him, took a few months off in Amsterdam to paint and to draw. And he's to this day, in prison, he's doing a lot of drawing. He has an unbelievable eye for color. And so he said, he's a retailer. And he said, okay, I'm going to make a newspaper that doesn't look like any other newspaper. And so other newspapers would have names like Oriental Daily or Economic Journal or Economic Times. And he said, I'm going to call it Apple. And why Apple? Because back in the biblical days, back in the day, Eve ate the first apple. And he said, that kind of started the descent of humanity, perhaps, but it also started gossip. It started news. He said, without the apple, there'd be no news. And, the logo was a bright red apple. And think about this. Every other newspaper in Hong Kong is black and white then. The New York Times was black and white. Everything is black and white. And Jimmy comes in, he gets the best printing presses in the world, these great Goss presses. Starts printing in color. He's got these big, bold graphics. He's using Cantonese language, the vernacular, which is generally spoken. They're kind of making up the characters to put them in writing. So he just brought this incredible sense of energy and vibrancy and of Hong Kongness. And Hong Kong people were really trying to find their way, their identity around as 156 years of British colonial rule ended and a new period of communist Chinese rule, colonial rule, I would say, began. And so Apple became this voice for democracy when nobody else would do it, but also a voice for Hong Kong. And let's remember, this wasn't some dull newspaper. It was horse racing. It was reviews of bordellos. It was, stock market tips. It was investigative reporting. It was paparazzi. And, there was, honestly, I'd argue there's not a newspaper like it in the world. It was a kind of a mashup. It took a U.S. context between the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it brought in everything and everybody needed to read it. Even though they said they didn't, but you'd get in the back of some tycoon's car and there'd be either Next Magazine, which predated Apple by 5 years, or there'd be Apple Daily. So it was kind of the guilty pleasure that even the elite in Hong Kong, even those who really disliked Jimmy, found themselves unable to withstand the temptation to read that.
Apple Daily's magical appeal to Hong Kongers lasted decades. And it would have continued had it not been for Beijing and Hong Kong authorities' heinous and desperate attempt to consolidate power in Hong Kong. Join Mark and I next week as we look at how the paper was forced to shut down and Mark's reflection on his portrayal of his friend, Jimmy Lai. You're listening to The Divide. This episode is produced by Radio Taiwan International.